Interact is a network that wants to create a strong community of researchers from a number of disciplines that wants to understand how manufacturing contributes to the economy, and in particular how we can improve the manufacturing base by enhancing innovation and diffusion of digital technologies. And an important aspect of our own activities to understand how manufacturing can contribute to wealth creation, both nationally and locally. And an important dimension of our work is really about the international dimension. So we want to understand better how other countries work in manufacturing, how they manage to strengthen their manufacturing base. And this is exactly what the international webinar wants to do. It wants to give us an insight on the experience of other countries or other groups of countries. And today we're going to talk about industrial policy. We're going to talk about industrial strategies and the connections with regional policies. And I think it's important to remember that for in many countries, manufacturing is at the heart of local economic growth, and this is a very there is a very basic reason for this. It's simply because manufacturing creates knowledge spillovers that tend to be localized and in turn can trigger local economic growth. As a result, we are in some countries talking about regional policy is the same as talking about industrial policies, and in reality they tend to be a byword for each other. Now, what we're going to talk today is the experience of the European Union in this respect. And we know that European Union has always had a strong program of regional policies that wants to reduce gaps in living standards and wants to facilitate local economic growth. And what we're going to look at today is the link between these programs and industrial strategies and interventions at industrial level and on the industrial structure. And to discuss these issues, we do have our own speaker, Professor Sergio Destefanis, Professor of Economics at the University of Salerno, is from Italy. He has studied in Freiburg in Switzerland at the University of Cambridge and has won a number of prizes for his research on regional economic issues. He has been a president of the Italian Association of Labor Economics, and he has published several papers on the EU regional cohesion policies and the impact on local economies. Unfortunately, our second speaker cannot make it. He has some health issues, but we will work with him to be able to offer again a webinar where he can present his work on the dark side of manufacturing for 4.0. Okay, so we're going to have Sergio presenting for, I would say, 3/4 of an hour. Then we're going to have Q&A. Please type down your questions, and either Sergio or will look at those, we'll check those, and Sergio will provide an answer. If for some reason we run out of time, then we will get in touch with the reply to your questions. As I said, we are very happy that you have managed to make it and to find time in your busy schedule for this webinar. And we would like you to invite you to check our Interact webpage and check all the activities that we have. And we will have some calls for research projects. We are organizing a summer school. We will have a presence at a number of conferences, and of course we will have our own Interact conference in October. So please stay tuned for our own activity. And without any further ado, I want to pass it to Professor Destefanis, who will talk to us about industrial policies and regional policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Vania. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to this workshop, to this webinar. It is a pleasure. It is a signal honor for me to be here. I also won't have much ado to do about the presentation before I go to it. I only want to say that I'm sorry that Dr. Kovac couldn't make it. I wish him very well. And the presentation which I'm going to give was also made thinking that he was going to give something more specific about manufacturing. My paper has to do with industrial strategy on a broader scale. And although I have a paper on manufacturing in the EU regional policy, which I published in Regional Studies, it is a paper about Italy. And Vania preferred that I could give something more general, something that could envisage the whole European Union, which is what I'm going to give today. And now, indeed, I go to the presentation and won't have much ado to do about it. I forgot to put my address, my email address or webpage on this presentation page, but of course, if you digit Destefanis Salerno, it will be me that comes out, and you're welcome to see the web page and to ask me any question about that. Now, I'm trying. Okay. I got a hold of the pointer. So I will present first broadly industrial strategy in the EU and its connection with regional policy. Then I will talk at some length about an empirical analysis which I recently carried out with a co-author of mine on the regional policy in the EU and its connection with industrial development, and especially with employment, because I think it is really important to stress that innovation is important. It is important to be innovative. It is important to create a very productive and modern industrial structure, but it is also important that this industrial structure creates employment, because otherwise it won't be able, in my opinion, to create prosperity and also to build a favorable public opinion vis-à-vis industrial policies of the European Union and the European Union at large. We will talk about the literature that connects with this particular issue, the link between regional policy and employment. Then I will describe the empirical framework, very shortly the data I use, which are freely available data. And we will talk about the main results and then go back, if I may say so, with the way forward. We will go back to the beginning and assess some things that have to be done about industrial strategy in the EU on the top of what has been found in the work that I present. So, on March 2020, the European Commission, of course, laid the foundations for an industrial strategy supporting a so-called twin transition to a green and digital economy. And we'll be back to this twin transition at the end of the talk. But obviously, the aim of this twin transition was to increase sustainability, of course, decrease the ecological footprint of the European industry, but especially it meant to make the EU industry more competitive in the global market and enhance Europe's strategic autonomy. I think it was quite an achievement to foresee that some problem of strategic autonomy was going to appear way before the Russian-Ukrainian war set on. Anyway, the day after the new industrial strategy was presented, the WHO announced that the COVID-19 crisis was a pandemic. And so, obviously, the economies of the European Union, as the economies of the rest of the world, were hit by this COVID-19 crisis, and the industrial strategy was, the EU industrial strategy was updated to promote also the recovery of the European Union economy in May 2021. What I want to stress is that this industrial strategy is centered very much on a program called Horizon Europe, which is centered around the European innovation ecosystems, about which we will talk about very shortly in a minute. And however, it is also intimately related with the European Regional Development Fund, about which we will talk more diffusely in a few minutes in my talk, because this European Regional Development Fund is part and parcel of the European cohesion policy or regional policy. The European Innovation Ecosystem Programs aims to create connected, inclusive innovation ecosystems that complement activities across the whole program of Horizon Europe at the national, regional, and local level, as well as involving private and third sector initiatives. So it is a very inclusive networking program that is centered around. Sometimes I have a bit of a trouble to go forward. Now I'm stuck. I wonder why. Before it was going forward well. Okay. Now, these are the ecosystems. There are 14 of them, and you see they are basically industrial sectors. And most of them are manufacturing sectors, going from textile to aerospace and defense, agri-food, digital, electronics, energy-intensive industries, renewables, energy renewables, mobility and transport. So many of these are indeed manufacturing. And again, oops, I have some, okay. I have to, still didn't get the hang of it, I'm afraid. So there will be some time elapsing between one slide and the other. But anyway, these ecosystems are designed as to bring together links between resources, financial resources, but also real resources like equipment and facilities, organization, which includes higher education institutions, research and technology organizations, companies, venture capitalists, and financial intermediaries, all together to the development of these particular sectors that we have seen above. Also, within this context, the EU has thought of some regional innovation valleys aiming to involve regions, especially with low innovation performances, to build strategic areas of regional strength and specialization, which are defined in the smart specialization strategies in support of the key EU priorities. These smart specialization strategies will be one of the fundamental characters in the paper that I'm going to present. Smart specialization strategies implement a place-based approach. So the idea is that you do not have a top-down idea of a top-down approach of economic development, but you think that economic development should create itself, as it were, in an area, building on the assets and resources available to regions and member states, and it should face their specific socioeconomic challenges in order to identify some unique opportunities for development and growth, where unique means idiosyncratic to any particular area we are considering. So it is place-based. We take the identity, the socioeconomic identity of all particular areas, and on these identities, both strengths and weaknesses, we try to build a particular development strategy, which of course includes a more innovative industry. This means that we will have to select a limited number of priority areas, which of course have to do with the strengths and weaknesses of these particular regions, for mostly knowledge-based investments, investments that have to do, broadly speaking, with the development of the communication technology and with the digitalization of the economy. Again, focusing on the particular strengths and advantages of each particular area. Hence, these strategies entail more effective spending of public resources. We identify these key areas with these key priorities, and we will be able to spend more effectively public resources on them. Also because we want to build synergies, which go also towards reduction of costs between public support mechanisms, especially for R&D and innovation, industrial promotion, and training institution. This is very important. This will be very important in the next few minutes. We have to emphasize that on the one side, we want to support R&D and innovation. On the other hand, training institutions. We cannot do this kind of strategy if there is no proper basis in the human capital endowment of the areas that we are taking into account. More effective spending will also mean that there should be some elimination of fragmentation and duplication of policy interventions. Now, it won't strike you as very topical, or maybe it is, but in Italy there is a big talk about the delays of the recovery fund. And some talk about these delays has to do with the fact that this expenditure has been excessively fragmented. But of course, if you want to give it also to municipalities, this kind of financing, to some extent, some fragmentation is unavoidable. But in any case, a smart specialization strategy should avoid this fragmentation as much as possible. And then there will be a fundamental point, which is fundamental for me because the rest of my talk will be very much on kind of evaluation paper about this kind of policies, but it is said very explicitly, very openly in all documents that you may care to read about smart specialization strategy, that evidence-based monitoring and evaluation should be done in order to select the knowledge domains and innovation projects that are most conducive to sustainable development in every particular area. So we have to focus on the key priorities, key areas, to get synergies between innovation expenditure, R&D, and human capital endowment. We have to eliminate fragmentation and application of policy interventions, and then we have to carefully, as much carefully as possible, to monitor this kind of developments. I trust you can see this slide well enough. This is what I'm talking about in a graphic terms, and I take the graph from Richard Tufts, belonging to the Friends of Smart Specialization, which is an organization that operates in the European Union. So we have to identify the ecosystems and the competitive advantage of each area. Then in each area, you should create, co-create, connect, communicate, and convince, which means that a network of various stakeholders and operators should come into existence. And these operators should belong both to the public and the private sector. And in the public sector, they should belong to various levels of government, national, regional, meaning what used to be called the NUTS2 regions, or what is still called the NUTS2 level regions in the European Union, and local, which is lower than NUTS2, going to a bigger level to a higher level of territorial disaggregations. All these levels should interact with each other to build a common strategy, to build a network. And once they collaborate, there should be a continual monitoring of these activities, which of course feeds back into the identification of relevant ecosystems and competitive advantages, because you see what really works. And again, I want to stress that the dimension of what really works, on which I will be focusing, is the creation of employment, because it matters socially, because it matters also politically. It's part of a strategy that could build not only higher wealth, higher welfare in the European regions, but also a bigger participation and a more favorable point of view politically to the European Union. This connects very closely with the regional policies, or as we will call it in the next slides, the cohesion policy of the EU. This is the main investment policy even nowadays. I will give you a few figures in the next slide. But obviously, this cohesion policy, I think you're all aware that it is something that considers all regions and cities in the EU to support job creation. I stress this. These are not my words. So these are official words. Job creation comes first. Then there is business competitiveness, economic growth, sustainable development, and improvement of citizens' quality of life. Again, these cohesion policies provides a necessary investment framework to meet the goals of the Europe 2020 strategy for more sustainable and inclusive growth in the European Union, about which we talked a few minutes ago. So the two things are very closely interconnected. But as I stressed, there will be a very important role taken by job creation into this kind of policy, and it will be right to monitor the job creation performance of this policy. Figures which I promised you. For the current programming period, which used to be the new programming period when I was thinking about these issues first a couple of years ago, we have allocated 330 billion for the cohesion policy in the European Union, which is almost 1/3 of the total budget of the EU, net of Generation EU, net of the recovery fund. What is also very important is that this cohesion policy is centered around a few policy funds, which we will call for short in the forthcoming minutes, the funds. And in recent years, also to go towards meeting the goals of the Europe 2020 industrial strategy, the European Union has encouraged regions to combine various kinds of cohesion policy funds or expenditure to achieve some synergies. Now, the main funds are the four funds that you see on the screen. The most widely spread fund is the fund about which we already talked at the beginning of this presentation, the European Regional Development Fund, which we also dub the ERDF. And this ERDF is created to reduce regional imbalances with a focus on productivity and competitiveness. It wants to stimulate the productivity and competitiveness of the so-called lagging regions, left behind areas. And so it used to be called also the objective one type of fund that will be geared to the objective one areas. Now we will talk, now in the European Union, we talk about the convergence objective areas. But anyway, you have some lagging behind areas, which are the main area of application of this particular fund. And the programs that are financed through these funds are mainly geared at the development of productivity and competitiveness. Actually, after the European Regional Development Fund, the most important fund is this fund here, the Cohesion Fund. However, this Cohesion Fund only applies to countries where GDP per capita is less than 90% of the average. For example, Italy, although it has a part of the country, the so-called Mezzogiorno, southern Italy, which is still very much lagging behind vis-à-vis the rest of Italy and the rest of Europe, Italy does not qualify for the cohesion fund because still nowadays GDP per capita in Italy is more than 90% of the EU average. On the other hand, Spain qualifies, Portugal qualifies, Greece qualifies for the cohesion fund, and the whole Central and Eastern European countries qualify for the cohesion fund. Together, the Cohesion Fund and the European Regional Development Fund make up more than 60% of the total expenditure of cohesion policies. And then you have a fund which is very much important for a particular sector, which is the EEAFRD, which is, of course, directed at the development of agricultural structures and rural areas. And then you have the European Social Fund, which, by the way, predates very much all other funds, having been created no less than in 1975. And nowadays, this European Social Fund is mainly focusing on active labor market policies. It is the fund that supports training, that supports the reskilling of the labor force that has been expelled from the labor market. And so, obviously, it is something very important when we talk about job creation. Capello and Kroll, two important authors in this field, pointed out already in 2016 that the smart specialization agenda encouraged regions to combine the European Social Fund and the European Regional Development Fund expenditures. It's easy to see this because, as was also highlighted in a very extensive studies by Ferry and Ka a few years ago, these two funds are likely to be very much complementary because on the one hand, you have the ERDF, which enhances productivity, and on the other hand, you have the ESF, which enhances the capability, the absorptive capability of the labor force vis-a-vis these developments in productivity. So on the one hand, you develop, as it were, the demand side of innovation and employment. On the other hand, you should improve the supply side of innovation and employment. And indeed, finding these particular synergies, this particular positive interaction, virtuous interaction, will be one of the main aims of the empirical work, which I'm going to present to you in a short while. However, it is also fair to say that synergic effects could also involve other funds, and this is something which we want to see and look for. Hence, we will propose an empirical analysis which thoroughly explores all possible interactions among these types of funds. Even more than that, we want to see whether there are synergies between these three funds, or four funds about which I talked about before, the RDF, the FRD, the ESF, and the Cohesion Fund, and private investment, gross fixed capital formation, that is, private fixed investment, and expenditure on R&D. So we have three big types of investment: gross fixed capital formation, R&D, and the European funds. And these European funds are themselves split in four categories. And we want to see if there are impacts on employment of all these forms of investment, and if there are also interactions between them, and if these investments are also interacting with other aspects of the economic environment in which they operate. Obviously, this analysis, its aim, is very much consistent with the evidence-based monitoring and evaluation facet of the smart specialization agenda, which I presented you a few minutes ago. We want to see if the policy works in order to see what works and what does not work, and to improve the priority areas and the modus operandi of this policy. This, of course, is part of a belief that investment is a mainspring of prosperity, but this not only means that investments should bring about higher productivity, it should also foster job creation, and so we focus on the job creation effects of all these expenditures. This is something which in the literature has been thoroughly explored at the sectoral level for whole countries or on microdata, but there is basically no study, or there are really very few studies that have been dealing with this particular kind of impact at the territorial level, which is what we're going to see now. Obviously, this has very important policy implication. Analyzing the nexus between investment and employment, at a territorial disaggregated level, which will be the NUTS 2 regions in the European Union, sheds light on how these particular forms of expenditures, private investment, R&D, that is private gross fixed capital formation, R&D, and the European structural funds, which will be dubbed the SF from now on. We want to see how these expenditures relate to the evolution of cross-region economic disparities. Obviously, hopefully, these expenditures should favor the development of all regions and also narrow the differentials between richer and poorer regions. And especially as far as the SF impact on employment is concerned, this is something which is really very seldom done in the literature. What I present from now on, and what I will call the empirical analysis, will be drawn from an article which has recently been published in Structural Change and Economic Dynamics, and it is joint work with Nakib Ur-Rehman, belonging to the Westminster University of Tashkent. So there is some UK after all behind this presentation. Now we pursue systematically the regional analysis of investment. We want to consider these three forms of investment and their interactions, but we will also want to see how they interact with the regional economic structure, as I said before. And the regional economic structure will be defined in a very precise way. We will consider some pillars of economic structure that comes from the EU Regional Competitiveness Index, which is an index which is developed by the European Union since 2010. And I will talk about that later on. But basically, we can rank regional economies along various lines: the quality of institutions, market efficiency, and technological sophistication. And so we want to see how the policies and the funds interact with each other and interact with these measures of economic development. We want to see if particular features of economic development make policies more or less effective. This all has to do also with the issue of resilience, because if these funds are able to create a positive job creation effect, they are also able to help a region recover its employment once it has been lost in a particular crisis. How am I going time-wise, Vania? How much time do I have left?
You have, I think, 10, 15 minutes. I
Okay,
think you're doing
good.
fine. Don't worry.
Good, good. So we also have to do with resilience, and this analysis is also important for resilience of regional labor market. Again, now the literature very, very shortly. The impact of gross fixed capital formation on employment. Technically speaking, there should be a direct displacement effect. When you employ more machines, you employ less people, you substitute workers with new machine and technologies. You are in the UK, so the country where Ludism was actually also in one of the very regions in which Ludism originated. So this is no novelty to you. But of course, there are compensation mechanisms, because more machines bring more productivity. More productivity brings more competitiveness and brings also higher incomes. And this competitiveness and higher incomes should boost aggregate demand and labor demand. We do not know much about these effects in regional data, and so this is part of the novelty of this work. Then, about R&D, which is a particular form of investment expenditure, we know something more precise. We know that it tends to increase employment in the innovative sectors, and to decrease employment in the less innovative sectors. So we expect that also region-wise, more advanced regions should be favored by more R&D, whereas less innovative regions should lose when R&D expenditure increases, should lose employment. About the relationship between structural funds and employment, we really know very few things. We only know that they may depend, these effects of structural funds on employment, on the context. Now, the context, every author defines the context as they please. In this study, we want to have an objective measure of the environment, at least a measure of the environment which is not cooked up by us, but produced by the European Union. And so we go to the 4 pillars of the EU Regional Competitiveness Index. The basic workhorse of our empirical study is this conditional labor demand function, in which E, employment, depends on wages, depends on GDP, depends on fixed capital formation, R&D, and on the 4 funds of which I talked about before. Then, of course, it will be a dynamic panel analysis. You see it by the T-1 subscripts, which means lagged variables. And it will also be a panel analysis in which we have both fixed effects for regions and for time. But we want to enrich this conditional labor demand function, taking an interaction of all investment expenditures with the pillars from the EU Competitiveness Index. So you see that, for example, gross fixed capital formation interacts with a pillar, and we will see in a few minutes what this pillar means. But this also applies to the R&D expenditure and to all expenditures from the EU policy funds, EU cohesion policy funds. So interactions with the socioeconomic environment. And these pillars, finally, we see them squarely, are 4 measures of economic development, if you wish, or socioeconomic structure. A basic pillar, which scores from 1 to 100, which is a measure of quality of institutions, macroeconomic stability, health, and basic education. The EU ranks all the European Union according to this particular basic pillar. It also ranks all regions according to an efficiency pillar, which measures higher education, labor market efficiency, and market size, and to an innovation pillar, very important in this analysis, which is a measure of technological readiness, technological sophistication or business sophistication, and broadly speaking, of innovation. All these 3 pillars are taken together, are summed up in a stage of development pillar, which has just 3 values, and the highest value is dubbed high. The second value, lower, dubbed intermediate, and very strangely, the lowest rank is called medium. This is the EU jargon. But anyway, these are 3 values, and according to these 3 values, you find yourself in a region that is a high, intermediate, or medium, summing up the performance of this region across the 3 previous dimensions. So there will be a lengthy economic analysis, and details of it are contained in the paper, but every one of the expenditure we talked about before has been interacted with every one of these basic pillars, and what we see in the next minutes is just the end result of all that. But again, before leaving this empirical framework part, I want to stress that not only we have the expenditures for investment, for R&D, for the EU policy funds, but also the interactions, the multiplicative terms across each one of these terms. and in empirical analysis, there is something which cannot be shown in a slide like this. We have simultaneously interactions across the funds and with the pillars that we have seen in the previous slide. The data come out from Eurostat as far as employment, wage, GDP, gross fixed capital formation, and R&D are concerned. They also come from an official EU source, which is called the historic EU payments for the cohesion funds. And then, of course, we have the pillars that also are of EU origin. So all of them are official data and freely available data. This is a graph of the pillars, and you see that basically there is some sort of bell-shaped distribution for the basic efficiency and innovation pillars. Only the innovation pillars show some kind of two regimes that may belong to a low and high level of innovation. So it was very difficult to separate a priori regions in highly developed and lowly developed. It was much better to interact them with these measures. And then, of course, the stage of development pillar is not bell-shaped at all, which explains why we chose these multiplicative interactions. It was really very difficult, if not impossible, to separate a priori the highly developed regions from less developed regions. So the main results, I trust you can see them. Basically, there are three particular specifications which I'm going to present. One very simple one which has the interactions of the funds with the pillars, and one which has both interactions of the funds with the pillars and interactions of the funds among themselves. In the simplest specification, you see that GDP and gross fixed capital formation promote employment. You do not see anything for R&D, and you see only a very small effect for two funds, the cohesion funds and the agricultural funds. When you start to consider interactions with the environment, you see that the R&D comes out very strongly interacting with the innovation pillar, meaning what I said before. If you are in a highly innovative region, the R&D stimulates employment, otherwise it does not stimulate employment. And there is also an important interaction of the fixed capital formation with innovation pillar, which, however, goes the other way around. So the more you are innovative, the less gross fixed capital formation promotes employment. We will comment about that afterwards. The EFRD is the only cohesion fund that interacts strongly with the environment, and there is a positive interaction with the stage of development pillar. The more you are developed, the more expenditure in agriculture promotes employment. This is easy to explain. If you are in a backward region, when you invest a lot in agriculture, you tend to shed away a lot of labor, and it is difficult to sustain job creation at an aggregate level. Then we have various interactions in the third column among also the funds. We still maintain these three interactions with the economic environment of which I talked just now, but we have also strong interactions among the funds, especially I want to stress that we have this strong positive interaction between the ERDF and the ESF, as the smart specialization agenda would leave us to believe. So by themselves, the European Regional Development Fund and the European Social Fund do not impact on employment, but their interaction is positive. If they are jointly worked about by smart specialization policies, they can develop employment. Very shortly, we made several robustness checks with different techniques of estimation, and we maintained the previous results. I can, of course, provide later on some more details about these robustness checks. So regional characteristics are an important driver of the employment effects of investment. I'm closing down in 5 minutes. Is it fine, Vania?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay. Then only in not two regions which are pretty innovative, competitiveness, sorry, only in not two regions which are reasonably innovative, R&D is likely to generate employment. And this accords with what we know about R&D in economic sectors. However, we have an idea that also can be related to the literature that the more innovative a region is and the less gross fixed capital formation promote employment. This may have to do with the fact that investment multipliers may be low in regions with higher development and less consumption. This may also be due to the fact that in more innovative regions, gross fixed capital formation may be linked to artificial intelligence and robots, and this particular form of investment may not be that employment friendly. However, on the whole, gross fixed capital formation promotes employment. Whereas this is true for R&D only in very innovative regions. About the funds, again, I want to stress the virtuous policy interactions between the RDF and the SF, which validates this mass specialization agenda. And there is also positive impact of the EFRD in the more innovative regions. As far as resilience is concerned, it is important to see that particular configurations of the cohesion policy funds are indeed helpful to job creation and so should make the regions more resilient. But it is also important to stress that R&D by itself only promotes employment in very innovative regions. So if one is very worried about resilience is in unknown innovative regions, it should be clear that at the same time one should operate on R&D, but also on more traditional forms of private investment, as well as acting upon the European policy funds. And finally, something which was not clear a priori is that there is also a strong interaction between the European Regional Development Fund, not only with the European Social Fund, but also with the Cohesion Fund. So expenditures in transport and communication infrastructure from the Cohesion Funds interact virtuously with expenditures from the European Regional Development Fund. What can we say now at the end of the talk, the way forward? We can say that indeed the smart specialization agenda is an important element in the connection between the EU industrial strategy and the EU regional policy. It could still be improved if more care is given to the effective coordination of multi-level governance. What I mean is that regions with a strong historical background that manage to be successful, like in Germany, North Rhine-Westphalia or Saxony, need some mechanisms for effective coordination with national authorities, because if these regions are very much successful, they can be so successful that they crowd out success in other regions, and so they have to coordinate more closely with the national authorities. On the other hand, everywhere regional authorities find difficulties in monitoring and evaluating policy implementation. And so there should be, on the one hand, more interaction among all the levels of government and other stakeholders to improve communication about the outcomes that have been achieved and to improve then monitoring and evaluation. And there should be a higher employment or deployment of digital techniques, of the digital economy, in trying to offer a knowledge base for producing more effective monitoring and evaluation of the policies. And on this we close because indeed smart specialization needs a more with the twin transition. And I explained just now what could be an easy way to foresee an interaction of smart specialization with the digital economy. On the other hand, the interaction of smart specialization with the green economy, it is still very much an open agenda on which I do not have to offer very clear-cut thoughts. On this interrogative note, I end my talk and thank you for your attention.
Form the future.